Welcome to my new podcast series that covers civilians during the Second World War. In today's episode, I will be covering the topic of rationing in Britain during World War II. In this episode, I will question the common assumption that British rationing was characterized by universal self-sacrifice and common purpose. My research has found that while the notion of fair shares for all was a principal theme of wartime propaganda, the experience of rationing actually varied amongst different social groups and classes in Britain. There were also individuals and groups who attempted to defeat the system of rationing through the black market. The first segment of the podcast will define the policy of rationing in Britain and the reasons behind its implementation. Rationing was inevitable for a number of reasons. First and foremost, rationing was intended to remedy any existing shortages at the start of the war and to prevent any future shortages from developing. Furthermore, it would prevent inflation by controlling the prices of goods, and it would also economise on certain commodities such as fuel in order to create reserves that the military might need. However, the main goal of rationing in Britain was to ensure a fair distribution of goods among all consumers. The basic premise of the system was simple. Firstly, individuals would register with their local retailers. Then, a limited allowance of basic foodstuffs, furniture and clothing was obtained by the individuals in exchange for coupons. If a person's coupons had already been deposited, it was illegal for a shopkeeper to sell any more rationed products to the customer. Everyone in Britain received the same amount of coupons, and this was called a flat ration for all. This was an excellent tool of propaganda as it promoted the image of universal self-sacrifice. However, the flat rationing system ignored the high calorie intake of heavy workers, and it also ignored the low calorie intake of small children. So it didn't account for the differential calorie intakes amongst different groups in society. The commodities initially rationed in 1940 were sugar, butter, bacon, ham and tea. All of these commodities were imported into Britain. This means that they were scarce because a lot of the merchant ships that delivered these goods were being attacked. Right. Now we've covered the basic policy of rationing, we shall move on to the next segment. This segment will explore the complex and varied responses of different social groups towards rationing. We'll first examine the working class. The poorer sections of the working class actually benefited from the policy in some ways. This is because before the war there was a massive inequality in nutrient intake, and these differences disappeared with the introduction of rationing. This is because they ended up having the same access to essential foodstuffs as the upper class did before the war. However, even though there was this small benefit, the working class as a whole experienced many issues with the system of rationing. For example, workers in heavy industry were particularly dissatisfied with the rationing of meat, which was highly prized as a marker of status and male privilege in the working class diet. In fact, roughly 72% of heavy industrial workers felt that their diet was inadequate, and they largely blamed this on the system of flat rationing, which made no allowances for their different energy requirements. This made meat the most politically sensitive of all rationed foods. For example, Lord Bevan, the Minister of Labour at the time, considered the low meat ration in 1941 to be the most serious danger to morale, and argued that an increase in the supply of meat was vital for the war effort. However, it wasn't just industrial workers that had grievances. It was also the housewives of the working class. When they went to shop at their local retailers, they often complained of the shortages and high prices of unrationed goods, such as fish and fresh fruit and vegetables. For example, Neither Last, who was a housewife who wrote a diary during the war, complained about this issue. She says in one of her entries, "Fish is very dear. In my budget, it's not worth the price of nourishment. I've always been used to making hotel meals, as the boys call them. Soup, a savoury and a sweet. If one is a good cook and manager, it's the cheapest way in the long run. As well as this constraint on the in terms of not being able to afford unrationed goods, there was also a constraint on the clothing that the working class could purchase. This is because the working class had quite a low income, and they only received a limited amount of coupons, 66 to be exact, which was only enough to purchase one whole outfit. And the outfits that they could purchase were of quite low quality. This is because the government introduced utility clothing in order to economise on precious materials for the military. And many complained that these clothes lacked durability, such as George Springett, who was a conscientious objector in Kent. He dismissed the utility clothing as shoddy stuff, and he also said that they didn't look very nice as well, and that they didn't suit the style of the working class. So, how did the working class respond to these kind of issues? One way was through self-reliance. The families of manual workers responded to the shortages of meat by keeping their own chickens and pigs. Most urban pigs were fed on scraps collected from strategically placed pig bins in the streets, and then they were fattened up, then killed for pork, bacon, ham, and this meat would be distributed across the whole neighbourhood and the workplaces of industrial workers. Chicken was also kept because chicken it was too expensive in the shops of retailers. Chickens were kept everywhere. They were kept. Let's have a look. They were kept in gardens. They were kept in backyards, in garden sheds, and on flat rooftops and balconies. And they would often be fed anything that the working class could find. Neela Last's diary actually recalls the struggle with trying to feed her hens. She says, I'll pick every bit of seeded grain I can get and hoard every scrap of grass seed and corn I can save. As well as keeping animals, self-reliance came in the form of the Dig for Victory campaign, which helped to mitigate the shortages of unrationed fruits and vegetables. By the end of the war, there were 24 different variants of leaflets produced by the Ministry of Propaganda. These leaflets gave all sorts of advice on wartime horticulture, such as digging up your lawn as a vegetable patch, or tearing out asters and sweet peas in order to replace them with more useful crops, such as runner beans and turnips. However, if this wasn't practical, and if someone's garden wasn't big enough, the advice was to actually grow your vegetables on top of the Anderson shelter. And by the end of the war, it was estimated that 500,000 of the nation's workers had an allotment where they were growing vegetables, and it was also estimated that they produced 10% of all the food that was consumed in Britain. The success of the working class in tackling these issues also depended on housewives who utilised their creativity, resourcefulness, and innovation, and to mitigate the constraints created by rationing. And women in their roles as housewives and mothers were primarily responsible for implementing the policy of rationing on a daily basis. Therefore, during the war, housewifing and motherhood acquired an enhanced sense of national importance, since rationing was vital in both maintaining public order, health, and morale. Thus, the housewife's battle on the kitchen front was as critical to victory as that of the soldier or the worker in essential industries. This is because the dietary changes generated by rationing and shortages altered culinary traditions. Therefore, recipes had to be adapted to wartime conditions, and brand new dishes had to be developed. The general aim was to economise on certain foods such as meat, eggs, sugar, and to make the most of plentiful foods such as bread, flour, potatoes, or seasonal fruit and vegetables. Therefore, an avalanche of government propaganda was intended to help housewives to cope. and to raise awareness of the significance of domestic activities and to maintain family health and morale. For example, a Ministry of Food leaflet declared the line of food defence runs through all of our homes. By saving food, you may be saving lives. Articles in magazines also instructed women how to make the most out of a limited supply of rations. For example, an article in Good Housekeeping said 14 shillings per head on food for a family of 5 doesn't allow a lot of margin, especially in wartime when prices are on the up and up. But by using your head and planning in advance as much as possible, you can produce 4 nourishing, well-balanced and possibly quite interesting meals for every day of the 7. The new recipes that emerged thanks to magazines such as Good Housekeeping included mock dishes, vegetarian main courses, and substitutes for commodities such as tea and jam. For example, mock goose consisted of sausage meat, potatoes, cooking apples, and cheese, and mock cream for pudding was made with milk, margarine, and corn flour. And vegetarian main courses included famous dishes like the Walton pie, which consisted of mixed vegetables and oatmeal topped with potato pastry. Also, jam was replaced with crushed parsnips that were laced with pineapple flavourings and banana flavourings. But it's important to note that you couldn't get actual bananas during the war. This is because they weren't imported during the war. Similarly, nettles were used as tea, as a tea substitute. The programme Country Life provided a guide on how to use nettles. It said during the programme, a note on nettle tea: nettles can be used satisfactorily as a vegetable. For example, you can boil nettles to produce nettle tea and nettle soup. However, it is advisable not to use the coarse, large leaves when boiling the nettles. However, working class housewives didn't just improvise when it came to food. They also improvised when it came to producing clothes for the family. Knitting was perhaps the most common form of improvisation. Wool garments were never thrown out. Instead, they were unravelled and the wool was rolled up around a piece of cardboard for later use. And they would use this wool that they gathered from discarded garments to knit jumpers, scarves, balaclavas, socks, and mittens for their families at home and in the armed forces. Government propaganda actually romanticised knitting as a communal activity done in front of a roaring fire by a happy woman. But one housewife recollected the activity less than enthusiastically. She said, "We didn't do anything else except listen to the wireless radio and knit. We were always knitting." She goes on to say that patching, knitting, and darning were time-consuming, boring pastimes, and often done after a long day of war work or childcare, forced on some of us by necessity, not choice. How did the middle class and upper classes of British society respond to rationing? And did they face the same issues that the working class did? Well, when it came to clothing, those in the upper and middle class of society were at an advantage. This is because wealthier shoppers could afford to buy more robust and durable clothes at more exclusive stores, whereas the less well-off had to use the same number of coupons for a cheaper government utility garment. Stores like Kay's advertised special items such as gambroon trousers, which were produced using a special type of cloth and were apparently designed to be as durable as iron. As well as affording these special goods such as gambroon trousers, the upper and middle class could also afford to send their clothes to innovation services. Stores like John Lewis and Peter Jones could make a dress out of a pair of flannel trousers. They could even turn nightgowns into day dresses, and men's suits and shirts into women's suits and blouses. The wealthy as well were also able to seize opportunities that the working class couldn't. For example, the novelist Anne Winfried recounted how she read in the newspaper one morning that the local zoo was selling the clippings from their camels' coats. So she went to the zoo during her lunch break and produced a sack, and she filled the sack with clippings from the camel's fur. She then promptly sent the clippings to a tailor in Scotland that managed to manufacture a jacket out of the camel clippings. Also, furthermore, despite the rhetoric of fair shares when it came to food, rationing only regulated the essential food items, and cash was still needed to pay for most of the unrationed goods. So those who had the money could easily afford to buy as many unrationed goods as they wanted to, and these included poultry, offal, fish, fruit and vegetables. Also, those who had the money would occasionally boast in their diaries about the exorbitant amount of money they would pay for simple items such as grapes, which were worth about £1 per bunch during the war. The diaries of social elites such as Chips Channon and Harold Nicholson are loaded with references to abundance and luxury. For example, an entry in November 1940 says, 4 magnums of champagne with friends at the Dorchester. London lives well. I've never seen more lavishness, more money spent, or more food consumed than tonight. Several surveys actually recorded the public's resentment at such obvious examples of the advantages the rich enjoyed over the poor. Many individuals in the working class felt like meals in restaurants should be paid for using coupons instead of money. This is because the rich would often go to restaurants and buy as much food as they wanted, as food wasn't rationed at restaurants. So in response to this grievance, the government limited the price of meals at restaurants to 5 shillings each. However, there was no limit on the number of meals you could order. So this means that the rich could afford to buy as many meals as they wanted to. So throughout the war, luxury gormandizing continued, and resentment continued to simmer among those unable to afford the same advantages as the upper and middle class in society. The final segment of our podcast covers the black market. The black market casts doubt on the myth of shared sacrifice, as many chose to oppose the system of fair shares for all. The black market could be understood as either organised crime involving the large-scale theft and delivery of rationed goods, or as minor infringements of the emergency legislation. After World War II, Lord Woolton said the fact that there was little or no black market in Britain was a tribute to the British people, which I hope historians of this period will record. However, the evidence amply disproves Lord Woolton's claim. In reality, there was a widespread infringement of the regulations by producers, distributors, retailers, and consumers. Under straight rationing, with the consumer-retailer tie, retailers' supplies were based on the number of registered customers, and supplies were also allocated assuming an increase in the number of people who registered. This is because it was difficult to keep registrations up to date throughout the country. Consequently, retailers were frequently left with a margin of unclaimed rations, which could be sold to favoured customers. And these favoured customers were usually willing to pay above the maximum price for these leftover rationed goods. And one example is in February 1942, when it was estimated that 1 to 8 million excess rations of tea were sold off the books. These kinds of activities of favouring certain customers were especially prevalent among butchers. Isabel Murphy's account of her childhood adds validity to this assertion that I made. She says that everyone had to be nice to my father, and more or less nice to us, even if they didn't like us, because my father was the butcher. A customer would walk in and bring in a parcel, and another would be brought out from under the counter. I nudged my brother, and we both knew there was a leg of lamb in that parcel, and that we had probably got something in return. It was notorious at the time that the social standing of the butcher in their community soared. They always received Christmas presents, and they were always supplied with drinks and cigars. And furthermore, the Ministry of Food virtually found it impossible to monitor the supplies of butchers, since meat was rationed by price and not quantity. Therefore, individual cuts of meat could be presented in a way to appear to be of a higher grade. Meat was also hard to track, since it was often processed into unrationed foods, such as pies. In fact, in Lancashire alone, it was reported that 80% of butchers were overcharging in cuts of meat. As well as small-scale crimes such as this, though, there were also large-scale crimes by organised criminals who planned to defeat the system of rationing on a big commercial scale. And this was the sort of activity that the police were really concerned about. The docks and railways were, of course, prime opportunities for these criminal entrepreneurs. The classic setup required a corrupt checker, a lorry driver accomplice, and a dealer to receive the unaccounted for goods. Peter Gannon, who worked for the Port of London Authority Police, explained, "The lorry would arrive in the docks for, say, 100 sides of beef, and the checker would ask him if he wanted some extras. If he was that way inclined, he'd take 110, but only sign for 100. And then on the way to Smithfield, he would drop the extra cuts of meat off at the butcher shop, or if it was fruit, at a greengrocer's shop." Statistics of railway thefts were pretty staggering. For example, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway Company lost more than £500,000 worth of merchandise in 1941 alone. And the railway police. This is because the railway policemen who were brought back from retirement were often not very energetic and were past running after thieves. And the policemen that were there had left to go and fight in the war. But perhaps the largest black market theft occurred when the new clothing ration books for the district of Romford were awaiting distribution. The district food officer in charge was Fred Barnes. His account of events states the following: "It was an old house with a huge cellar, and I thought, this is the place for the ration books to be stored. I fixed 2 huge padlocks on the cellar door, an electric alarm bell, and had 2 night watchmen outside. One morning the police ran and said, 'You've been done. Your ration books have gone.' And I just couldn't believe it. The cellar had an outside lavatory over its far end, and the thieves had pulled up the floorboards of the lavatory, hopped through onto the ration books, and loaded them into sacks. Meanwhile, the watchmen upstairs were completely oblivious." This event was considered by the government as dangerous. And as a result, it didn't receive any publicity in the newspapers. It was completely censored in the media. This is because with a street value of £5 per book of coupons, there was about £500,000 worth of coupons now on the black market, which was equivalent to about £7 million at today's price. And if the public knew that this that this kind of event went on, it would have destroyed their faith and confidence in the system of rationing, and it would also debunk the claim of fair shares for all. Alright. To conclude the podcast, rationing in Britain was not defined by universal self-sacrifice. This is illustrated by the uneven distribution of unrationed foods, and it's also illustrated by the uneven distribution in the quality of clothing amongst the different classes. Also, it's also illustrated in the way that classes had to react to the system of rationing. For example, the working class had to adopt numerous methods of self-reliance and improvisation in order to maintain their lifestyle, whereas the upper and middle class of society had disposable income that could be spent on unrationed goods, restaurants, and high-quality garments. However, the black market probably offers the ultimate challenge to the propaganda of universal self-sacrifice, as it shows that there were some individuals and groups who actively attempted to defeat the system of rationing and fair shares for all. just before we finish the podcast, I would like to now interview my grandfather, who was a child back when rationing was still implemented. So can you remember using the rationing books?
Yeah, well, I used to not actually take the ration book to the shop, but a coupon from the ration book, depend on what my mother wanted, you know. If she wanted butter or sugar, then she would give us a coupon to go down to the cooperative store and pick the items up.
Yeah.
That's how it worked. I mean, I don't exactly know how many coupons she had in her ration book, because there was my mother, there was like four of us, my sister, my brother, myself and my mother. Mm-hmm. My dad was in the army at the time. But it went on that, even when my dad came back from the forces, the rationing still went on for quite some time.
Yeah.
Apart from a few items like bananas. I remember when I was about 10 years old, I'd be about maybe 9 or 10 years old, queuing up for bananas at the fruit shop. And bananas, I'd never seen a banana before. You know?
Yeah, it's crazy.
It was quite a strange experience. You know, this banana, and you could eat it. I'd heard of them. And also when the sweets, like sweets and chocolate, came off the ration, and that would be around about the same time. And I remember the big queues at the sweet shops for that, you know. Well, because you used to have a coupon, to get a bag of sweets, you know. All sorts of strange things. Like I remember we ate a lot of rabbit.
Yeah.
You could buy a rabbit from the butcher's shop. They would be hung up in the butcher's window with still the skins on. And my mother used to skin them and cook them. I used to like rabbit. I've still got a taste for rabbit. But I say rabbit, I'll still buy it because that's what we ate, you know. Chickens were very expensive. We didn't keep chickens because we had no way to keep them. But chickens were quite expensive to buy. Other forms of meat were, you could get. I remember going to the shop and buying a sheep's head.
Oh, lovely.
You know, at the butcher's, and carrying the sheep's head home and looking in the bag and seeing this sheep's head. It was skinned and everything, you know.
Yeah.
And my mother would take the brains out, still had the brains in, and she would fry them for my dad. This would be around about 1952 or something, you know.
Aye.
Frying them for my dad for his supper. I never tried them, like, you know. And then she would boil the sheep's head, get all the meat off it and make a pan of Scotch broth, which was barley and vegetables. It was lovely.
Can you remember anything about the American supplies that were sent?
Oh, yes. I remember there was quite a lot of American army supplies left after the war. And the year would be around about, I'll be about 10, 11 years old, maybe not quite that. I remember my dad buying it, because my dad was out of the army then, and he was back in his old job that he had before the war, and carrying this big sack, it was, of American army supplies. They had to buy them. I don't exactly know how much they were, like, but I think it was £1, which was a lot of money at the time.
Yeah.
And it was full of all sorts, tin cigarettes and all sweets, all sorts of stuff in there, sugar. I couldn't remember everything that was in there, but it was full of like army supplies, you know, what they would, what the soldiers would use for rations and that, you know. Yeah. And if you could, there must have been such an enormous amount left when the Americans left, you know. They left everything behind, you know. And the butchers, I remember buying pig's trotters, which are the pig's feet.
Oh, yeah. I remember you telling me about that.
And my dad used to eat them. I don't know how they cooked them. I've never seen them. The only time I've seen them today was in a Chinese supermarket across Newcastle.
Yeah.
And I said to your grandmother, look, pigs trotting. Or my dad eating them.
Yeah.
So obviously the Chinese are still eating them.
Yeah. Do you remember anything about the black market at all?
Oh, the black market. Well, I remember me grandmother buying horse meat at the butcher's, which was illegal. I think it's illegal to eat horse meat now.
Yeah.
But occasionally, if a horse died, like, they weren't going to bury it.
Yeah.
So the butcher would get a supply of horse meat. And I remember she had a big joint of horse meat, and tenders were it was. I would be about maybe 5-year-old, you know, and having some horse meat, and it just tasted like beef. I would say, just tasted like the beef she used to buy sometimes when she could. And it must have been just after the war. But the black market, I mean, if you had the money, you could almost get anything. Anything you could get if you had the money.
Yeah.
So there's always somebody there could get it for you, you know. So people it was just about survival, really, you know. Some people went without, and some people hadn't had too much.
I would like to thank my grandfather for participating in this podcast, and I would like to thank you all for listening. Tune in next week when we will be talking about gender on the home front. Goodbye.